Hello everyone, welcome. Today we're gonna be making an abstract animation, right? Made out of particles in geometry nodes. It's gonna be a lot of fun and I think you'll learn a thing or two as well. To start this off, I'm gonna keep the default cube. It is completely usable, but not really. I'm gonna open up a geometry node tab, hit new, and this is going to be the place where we do our stuff. So I don't really want to start off with a cube, but I want to start off with something that's a little bit easier to adjust. So I'm gonna just disconnect this, Shift A, and I'm gonna add a new curve line. This is going to be the foundation of our abstract stuff. And you may think, why would you start with a curve? Well, you'll see. So this is a curve. Right now it only has 2 points, a bottom and a top. So I want some more points. So I'm gonna add a resample curve and set this to, let's say 30 for now, that's fine. And let's set the Z value to a bit more like 5. So this is now a line. So how are we going to turn this into something abstract? Well, a lot of abstract things are made out of noise textures and other textures as well. And that is what this one is going to be using a lot as well, right? So the first thing is the general noise. So let's hit Shift A, set position, make sure we can actually change the position of those points. And then the offset is going to be a noise texture. Now, if you add a noise texture, your initial object is going to move by 0.5 in the vector. So let's add a vector math set to subtract and subtract at that 0.5 value, right? A vector in the -5 value is going to be subtracted. And that's just something that happens with noise. And we also want to connect this yellow color value there. Then it is quite soft. So we're gonna just duplicate this and set this to scale. And then we can actually scale this up. You can see it's getting stronger and stronger. Let's crank down the detail to 0, roughness to 0, and the scale to about 2 perhaps. So this is going to be our initial noise value. And perhaps we need a little bit more geometry. So let's just set this to 50 for now, right? So it doesn't really matter that much. So this is something we can play around with now. So if we set this to 4D, we can just play around with the W value, right? The initial noise. And I want one kind of seed value that we can change later. One button that will completely randomize the system. And to do that, we need a group input connected to the W of our noise texture, right? Because that will pretty much be the seed, right? And if we go to the group tab there, we can set this W value to be, let me scale this up a little bit. We can set that to be an integer. And that means that if we now add 1 here, it's going to set our noise texture to a different offset every time. Beautiful, right? So that's going to be our initial noise. Now, this is only 1 layer of noise. I want to add another layer. And to do that, we're just going to duplicate that pretty much, right? So this is going to be the initial layer. And we're going to add a second one. So I can just move this to the left a little bit. And we can actually just Control G this to group it. Now our W is already a nice input, but I also want the scale of the noise to be an input and the strength as well. So call that scale and this strength and exit your group once again. And name this noise. Beautiful. And this too, noise. All right, so now we have one noise input pretty much, right? And I'm just gonna duplicate this. There we go. Crank in the same W value. And I'm gonna set the scale to be about 0.3 and the strength to be a bit lower as well. Right, a second layer of noise pretty much. Let's see. We can change the scale values and stuff like that quite easily. And I'm just gonna add a bit more points now because I wanna see how this is actually looking right now. Now if we change this W, you can see that still our entire curve is going to change direction, right? Quite interesting. Crank up the strength a little bit more even. You can see me playing around with this quite a lot. There we go. Right, so I prefer to have my abstract piece right now a little bit stretched in the X direction. So before we're going to add an actual mesh and points and particles, we're going to stretch this out a little bit. And I'm going to do that after my initial noise texture. So I'm guessing right about there. So Shift A, transform geometry, and I'm going to stretch this out in the X direction to a value that I'm satisfied with. Something like that, 3. All right, so let's call it 3. Beautiful. Then I'm gonna add my initial geometry where we can scatter points on. So to do that, I'm just going to turn this into a mesh first, right? Shift A, curve to mesh. Then a profile curve is going to be a curve circle. That's a quadra Bezier curve circle. There we go. And the resolution, let's set this to be quite low because there's just going to be points scattered in that. So I'm setting this to 5. And the radius 1 is fine. So I want to have a random radius as well. So we have thicker points in the abstract piece, and we have thinner points, and that will be beautiful later. So let's drag this a bit to the right, Shift A, and let's find ourselves a set curve radius. There we go. And this radius is going to be a noise texture once again. Connected color value, hit Shift A, and let's find a math node to just crank up that strength a little bit. There we go. Now we can play around with the detail, set it to 0, roughness to 0, and the scale, we can set this to be a little bit lower. All right, quite low I want this to be. Let's say something like that. And let's actually add a little bit of resolution here so we see what is going on. Not bad. And I'm actually going to add a color ramp. Shift A, color ramp, because I feel like the parts that are thin aren't thin enough yet. So I'm just going to crank that down a little bit. Something like that. Right, just so we get some thinner parts, and the white is totally fine. And we can now crank that up a little bit more even. It doesn't matter if they overlap, by the way. It really doesn't, because particles in the end will be able to overlap fine. The mesh, not so much, but that's totally okay. So now what? How do we get this to be points? So there's two ways that I tested. One is going to be converting this to a volume and then scattering points in a volume. It's going to take too much time. It's going to take too much performance as well, because volumes are just a step up in terms of performance. So we're just going to distribute points on these faces, and then we're going to have a second layer of points a little bit more to the inside, to the core. So let's do that as well. So I'm just going to move this up slightly so everything is nice and tightly packed into like a little bit of a package. There we go. So curve to mesh, beautiful. And then I'm just going to add another one. So I'm going to hit Control Shift D on all of this pretty much. Control Shift D. And this is going to be our second inner core layer, right? So let's move this up a little bit, and this as well. And for that second one, I want the curve radius to be a little bit less, right? So I'm gonna crank this down. Let's see, let's join this up first, join geometry, so we can actually see what it looks like. There we go. Now if we crank this radius down, you can see that we're getting an inner layer as well of points. And we have just another bit of randomness that we can now add to both of these versions, the outer and the inner. So let's move this to the right a little bit. There we go. And now let's just hit Shift A, and let's find, we're gonna start off with another noise perhaps. Set position, there we go. And actually we can just duplicate this one, right? Because we already used that. And then we can also crank in this W value that we had before. Beautiful. And I'm gonna set the scale to be a tiny bit lower. Something like that. So there's a little bit of a different feeling, but not too much. And I'm gonna duplicate this to the bottom as well. And there we go. And I'm going to connect the same W with Shift and right mouse. Hold that. You can actually add another point in your lines and just drag it out from there. W. And let's set the scale to be slightly different. Maybe a bit more even. Let's see, something that doesn't look too crazy. Something like that. It matches quite alright. Or what we could do as well is hit Shift A, a math, and just add a little bit of value to that W. Right, so it is going to have a little bit of an offset, but not too much, and it will be interacting quite nicely. Beautiful. Alright, then it's finally time to add some points, some particles. So let's hit Shift A, distribute points on faces. There we go. Beautiful. And do the same thing for the bottom, right? Amazing. So I'm just going to set a resolution for these points. Shift A, set point radius, and for the bottom as well. and the bottom is going to be slightly thinner, 0.025 perhaps. So there's going to be a little bit of a change there. So if you crank up this density, it's going to look a little bit odd, of course, because everything is still quite closely packed together. Let's set the densities a bit higher actually, so we can see a bit more. And what we're gonna do is add another layer of noise after we've turned it to particles. So not everything is as nicely together as they should be. So Shift A and add another, well, let's just add another noise texture there, which also resets the position. And we can actually see what kind of scale we're looking for with what strength, right? So I want this to be randomized, something like that. And I'm gonna crank the same W value in here. Beautiful. And Shift D that to the bottom as well. And crank in the W. Let's crank in this one, right? So we add a value there. Beautiful. And let's play around with that scale and the strength as well. A little bit more strength should be cool. There we go. Right? So keep that at a value you like. You can copy mine if you'd like. And then we can just play around with the values. And then once everything is joined together, I'm gonna add one more layer of noise, right? You can see I'm adding a lot of noise, but it's what really makes this stuff work. There we go, maybe a little bit. Something like that, perhaps. Right, this looks quite alright. Right, so what else do we have to do? Well, it is pretty much already set up, but we want to animate this. Right now, if we hit play, nothing happens, right? So how do we make this happen? How do we make this animated? Well, it's all done with the W value, right? And we can control each of these values with a single slider, perhaps, right? So the fun thing is we have a W value in all of our noise textures, and we could also add one right here, 4D, and we can crank in this W there, and this W there as well. And this is the W value that is gonna be animated as well, right? So one value, so hold Shift and drag right mouse along all of these lines, and it's gonna combine them all into a single point. And in front of this, we can do some magic, right? So hit Shift A and find a math node. And we're gonna add a value over time to that W, right? So we're basically animating that W value. Now, I don't want to keyframe anything, so I'm just gonna click it and type in hashtag, where did it go? Hashtag, I've had to find my Shift key. Frame divided by 500 perhaps, right? And now if I play this, you can see that everything is animated. Everything is moving quite nicely, right? So this is actually the exact speed at which it's going to run as well. Once we add more points, the animation is going to run slower. So we can already set up the speeds now of your animation. I think there's a little bit fast. So I'm going to do frame divided by 800 perhaps. It's going to make it a little bit slower. That looks quite all right. Perhaps that's first level of noise can be a bit stronger, right? So let's set the strength to be like 35. Let's see. And let's change the seed a few times. Let's see what happens. All right, so you can see that every time we're getting a completely different shape, and it's all gonna be moving slowly as well. Isn't that nice? Let's actually set the second level of strength a bit higher as well. 0.3 perhaps. I want everything to be moving quite nicely over time. Yeah, I like that a lot. All right, that's quite nice. And we can even add a little bit of randomization, so not everything moves at the same speed. Let's say we want this inner part, right? We split it off right about, where did we split? Here we split it off. And we can actually, from that point forward, every W value, we can give it a little bit of a different timing, right? So right here, where we split this off, we can add another little point. And in front of that, we can add another add node with hashtag frame divided by, let's say we want to add 1,000. That's a bit too much, I think. 1,500. So the higher we do this, the slower it goes. So that's why I said so much. So it's now a little bit of an offset there. And everything is going to be moving at different speeds as well. Some stuff is actually a little bit too fast still. So let's set this to 3,000 perhaps. I think that's looking a bit better already, right? And if it's too fast, we can just crank this one down as well. 1200, right? It's not that hard to control. So this is going to be our timing value, okay? So what I want to do next is actually add a material, right? So we have the geonodes. Let's go to the material tab, and if there is no material, just add a new one, right? Hit plus, and name this new, and name this abstract. Beautiful. Now we can open up a new window by hello. There we go. Shader editor, home, if you can't find your nodes. And this is going to be the start of our abstract shader. Now first, apply that to your geonode setup by hitting Shift A and search for a set material. And set this to be abstract. Beautiful. So let's go in rendered view. I'm going to go to cycles as well. Set to GPU. Right, so the reason that we can't really see anything in Evee, but we can in cycles, is because we haven't really added anything to the points yet. Right, we haven't added geometry. And I'm not gonna. But I'm gonna stick to cycles for this one. And that means we can keep our points, and it's gonna save us a little bit of geometry and performance issues as well. So in Evee, if you wanna use this, just add where we have our points here at the end. So we added our noise just before the material. You can hit Shift A and find an instance on points, just like that. And we can make this instance, for example, just a small cube with a size of 0.01. Crank that into the instance, and it's gonna take a while, but there we go. Right, it still works, but it's gonna take some more computing power because we're actually gonna be adding a lot of instances and stuff, right? So keep that in mind. So I'm just going to work with my points, because in cycles that works fine and a lot faster as well. Right, and then we can actually start adding materials. So to do that, I'm first going to crank up my density to about 150 at the top, or maybe even more. Let's say 300. And at the bottom, we can set this to 150. And I'm just going to use my little points light here to be the one who, pretty much shows the shape there. And we can crank that up. But first, let's crank this background strength down by a lot. There we go. And I'm going to go to my cycles view. I'm just gonna denoise that as well and set it to optics. There we go. Right, so this is our initial shape. You can already see that our abstract shapes are coming along nicely. All right, beautiful. So let's add some color and some other stuff as well. So first things first, for the base color, I'm actually gonna use a little attribute from our geometry node setup. All right, and the attribute is going to be one of these noise textures. So what we can do is I can go into the noise texture, into the group, and we can actually use the color output of that noise texture and crank it into the group output. And this means that our noise texture group now has an output as well. And right here, after we've combined our geometry and we added our latest layer of noise, we can hit Shift A and store named attribute. We can set that to be color. And we can use our input to be one of these noise output colors, right? And which one is completely up to you. I'm going to use the second one because I think it looks the best. And this noise, crank that in there. And we can name this to be noise. Now in our principal BSDF, we can access this, right? We can hit Shift A, find an attribute, set this to be noise, right? The same attribute we just stored. And crank that into the color. And now we're actually getting some different color values right here. Isn't that beautiful? So I want to customize the colors a little bit, of course. So let's hit Shift A, find a color ramp from black to white first, but we can set the left side to be like a nice bluish color like this. And the right side to be more of a pink one, perhaps like that. And just close them a little bit. So we actually get two of these values. You can do any color you like. Of course, it's not up to me to decide your colors. So go nuts. I like something like this, I guess. Maybe a little bit more desaturated and greenish. There we go. And I'm actually going to scatter my light in the geometry node as well. Reason why is because I want my light points in this abstract noisy kind of mesh to be different every single time as well. So it appears that there's like a light point, a light source inside of this chaotic abstractness, and that's moving along with the actual the abstract shape, right? So let's access that geometry node, and right here at the end we can do some other magic. So drag and drop your light point in and just hide it here, right? And then we can hit Shift A, join geometry, and we can actually just rejoin our object now, our light point, and you can see it doesn't work. And for some reasons, you have to make your lights an instance, and then they will appear beautiful, right? So there we go. And we now can just, well, change the position how we did it before with a noise texture, right? So copy this one, Shift D, and set it to be right there, right? I'm gonna hide this part for a sec and go to Object View and re-enable my overlays. And let's see what happens. So this W has to be animated as well. I'm not going to connect it to my group input because I want to have this one as a separate value with a separate speed. So I'm just going to see how it looks if I do #frame divided by 1000. It's going to be very slow and the strength needs to be much, much higher. Right, there we go. And the color, of course, it doesn't really matter. So let's see. It's a little bit slow still. Let's set this to be 500. So now it's going to be moving through our mesh. And it's still quite slow, I say. I'm going to crank up my scale a little bit. See what that does. All right, so the strength is a bit too much now. Let's set this to 30 or 40 perhaps. Yes, that is better. A little bit more. There we go. So now it's actually moving around a bit too fast though. So set this to 1000 now. Amazing. So that is one of our lights, and I want 2 or 3. How many you want doesn't matter. So I'm going to Shift D this, set the same speed, #frame divided by 500, I think it was. No, by 1000. And I want a little bit of a different position for this one, of course. Otherwise, it's going to be the exact same. So we can just type in 5 plus frame divided by 1000. And that's going to add 5 to our W, right? And that's going to give it a little bit of a different offset. So rejoin that there. And then you can see both our lights are moving in different directions beautifully. All right, so we can even crank up that strength a little bit. And this one as well, to like 60. And then they're going to be moving more out to the outer points as well. So let's rejoin this and see how it looks. Render view. And now we have 2 nebulas. It looks a little bit like it. 2 little light points there, right? And we can just control the strength and stuff like that in our original light. So we can crank this to a 5000, for example. And everything's going to be looking nice and bright. Amazing. And now to see what it would look in the final version, we would have to add a little bit more points, right? Because right now we can see a lot of these points still. So I want to add a little bit of extra density there. I'm going to crank this to 1000, for example. And I'm going to crank the bottom one to be 300, perhaps. And now you can see that everything is kind of packed. Everything is quite dense. And the real magic comes at the point when we actually add a little bit of transmission. All right, so the points are actually going to be letting through some lights and stuff like that. And then some parts will be darker and the parts with the light will be nice and bright. So we get more contrast in that. So let's crank this up and see. All right, so you can actually see the magic happening here. Beautiful. Something like that. Now I'm also going to crank up my metallic value perhaps. Am I? Not sure. Let's play around with the roughness too. See what that does. Actually looks interesting. But you can see that the transmission value is the value that actually controls most of this. Right, and those light points, we can crank up the radius a little bit to smoothen out those light areas. And now we can just play around with color and with shape, stuff like that. So let's hit Shift A, find a hue saturation real quick, and saturate that up just a little bit. Like that, for example. And then we can just play around with our W value, right? Find an abstract shape that we really like. Just play through it, find what you're looking for, and you Always change your noise values and stuff like that as well, right? So this already looks quite nice. We can rotate this around, see what happens. It all works quite nicely in real time. Once you've hit that W value, you can just rotate this, zoom in, see how it looks, zoom out. So you can see abstractness quite easily, right? And we already animated all the values. You don't have to put in any keyframes. So if you render this out now, it will all be moving nicely, right? And you've seen how it looks at the start of this, right? So that's pretty much it, right? Play with the colors. I like a red as well, like this. And then I'm going to set this one to more of a white color, right? There's a lot of different color combinations you can make. All right, well, I'm going to cut it off here. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a like, a comment, subscribe. I will enjoy any one of these. And then I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.